This is Duke University.
Well, good evening. Welcome to The Fight for a Fair Society. Is Pragmatism a Betrayal? With former Congressman Barney Frank. I'm Fritz Mayer, Associate Dean for Strategy and Innovation at the Sanford School and Director of the Center for Political Leadership, Innovation, and Service, or POLIS. Our event tonight is sponsored by the Sanford School of Public Policy, my center POLIS, the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and the Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Center for Ethics, Public Policy, and the Professions. Thank you to all the faculty and staff who've made this possible. So as you can see from the signage above me, this year we're celebrating the centennial of Terry Sanford's birth. Terry was, of course, governor of North Carolina, and later a U.S. Senator from North Carolina, and really a transformational figure in the second half of the 20th century. But between those times, he was president of Duke University, during which time he founded what is now the Sanford School of Public Policy. And Terry would be delighted with our speaker tonight. Although they speak differently and they have different styles and come from different backgrounds, in their political careers, Barney Frank and Terry Sanford had much in common. Both grew up among common people and never forgot where they came from. Both believed in the power of government to make people's lives better. And both believed in balancing principle and pragmatism, a theme I think the Congressman will speak about tonight. For 32 years, representing the Boston area in the U.S. House of Representatives, and before that, 8 years as a state representative in the Massachusetts legislature, Barney Frank both stood for something and got things done. Long before he came out as the first voluntarily open gay member of the U.S. Congress, and certainly thereafter, Congressman Frank stood for the rights of LGBTQ Americans and found ways to advance the frontier of civil rights against the considerable resistance of the time. On economic policy, where he developed a deep expertise, Congressman Frank consistently stood for working and middle-class Americans as he worked across the aisle on tax, trade, and regulatory policies that also promoted economic growth. One of the very few members, maybe the only members, to see the home mortgage and banking crisis on the horizon, Congressman Frank was absolutely indispensable in averting disaster in 2007 and 2008 and crafting legislation that stabilized the financial sector while reining in the worst excesses of the banking industry. On these and many other issues, Barney Frank earned a reputation as a keen intellect, a principled legislator, and a sharp wit among his colleagues in the U.S. Congress. This week, Congressman Frank is in residence here at Sanford, and we've been taking full advantage. He's made multiple appearances in classes and met with multiple student groups. His intellect, knowledge, and wit have been on full display. Many thanks to you, Congressman Frank, for being an inspiration to our students this week. And more than that, many thanks to you for your extraordinary career in public service. So now please join me in welcoming to Duke former Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you, Fritz. I am very happy to be here under the auspices of Terry Sanford through my great friend and ally and comrade in arms, Joel Fleischman. I got to know Governor Sanford. In fact, Joel, I think it is just short of 50 years ago when you and I and the governor went to Lockover's in Boston to have dinner after Albert Lowenstein's wedding in 1966. So I'm glad to be here with friends in this gathering, and glad to have a chance to talk about this topic, which I think is becoming very relevant. It's an interesting thing now. In both political parties, there are questions about whether or not those who are elected to represent viewpoints are being true to their causes, and in particular whether they're selling people out by compromising. So, and this is a topic that's troubled me for a while. I'm a great believer in free speech, including on university campuses. And I do have to say, on the question of university campuses, and I have to take advantage of being on a great university campus to say this, the argument from some of the students that there is a problem and that they should be in some ways protected or at least warned against things that are going to make them uncomfortable, that they'll intrude on their sensibilities. I can remember encountering that argument when I first came out. As Fred said, when I, in the 70s, had acknowledged that I was gay, and we then were having the fight about gay issues, I encountered often the argument that I shouldn't make certain statements and other people shouldn't do certain things because it made other people uncomfortable. People wanted trigger warnings. People wanted to be protected against this. Essentially, what they wanted to be protected against was lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender people. The people, transgender was still somewhat not a big issue. There was a book called Heather Has Two Mommies. That was a very important book for younger gay and lesbian people and their children. And that was banned from a lot of places under the same rationale that some speakers are shut down at universities, because it made people uncomfortable. It invaded their comfort zone, and people had a right to be protected against that. And I remember very strongly, those of us who were older, a couple of my longtime gay friends are here, Peter and me, one of the things we were warned against were PDAs. I don't know if people understand what a PDA was. It is a public display of affection. And those of us who were gay and lesbian were told that we should not show affection publicly to our same-sex partners because that made other people uncomfortable. It intruded their space. It violated their belief system. It made them feel uneasy. And I thought that was wrong then, and I think it's wrong now. But I do want to advise, I would give advice to some people, including some younger gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people here, be very careful of that argument, because it could come back and be used against you. In fact, just in general, I would advise, we're often told that people from the most vulnerable groups should be protected against this, but just as a practical matter, almost by definition, those groups in the society that have the least political power are the ones most likely to be shut up. So they should be very careful about embracing the weapon of enforced ending discussions. But I've also, as I said, I'm a great believer in free speech. I would let anybody say anything. But if I were going to make an exception, there were a couple from time to time. One of the exceptions I'd been tempted to make, not terribly relevant to tonight's subject, but I would like to ban the use of metaphors in the discussion of foreign policy. Not just the domino theory, but they really, people look at a map, and even Winston Churchill, a great strategic mind, caused a lot of ruckus during World War II because he didn't want a cross-channel invasion. He wanted to invade German-occupied France through the soft underbelly of the Mediterranean. Well, I guess there was a rough analogy to France and a crocodile, if you look on a map. But the fact is that the Mediterranean coast of France is no softer than the Normandy coast. It is an entirely inapposite metaphor. I also remember being told that Korea was posed like a dagger at the back of Japan. It always struck me there was a little ethnocentrism there because I didn't understand why the part of Japan that faced Asia was the back of Japan. It seemed to me that would be as likely to be the front of Japan, and we were looking at the back of Japan if we could see it. But whatever the relationship of Korea and Japan was, the fact that Korea was roughly dagger-shaped was totally irrelevant. No one was going to take Korea and stab Japan with it. And so but I leave that aside because I've since decided what I would like to do is to make it illegal to use pragmatic and idealistic as if they were opposites. and I run into this, and I run into people who are strong advocates, and I will be explaining why I think a certain course of action is important. They say, well, you're a pragmatist. I'm an idealist. So I will start with it's something I just wish people would not say. Start with that as a basic framework. Yeah, if you are in public office, if you are making rules to govern other people's lives, if you're using the coercive mechanism of the state to make people behave in ways that they would not otherwise behave, which is what the law is, the only potential justification for that is to be idealistic, to have a set of values. Only if you have a set of moral values does it justify using that force. But once you have a set of values, the notion that there's some kind of tension between your ideals and being pragmatic, the more deeply committed you are to your ideals, the more it would seem to me morally obligated you are to implement them. And pragmatism is the only thing that makes your ideals worth something. I mean, ideals without any pragmatism, without any concern for whether or not they were implemented, is kind of a recipe for you to feel morally superior and not help anybody else. No unrealized ideal ever fed a hungry child or provided medical care to someone who needed it or prevented pollution or did anything any good. Now, there are questions about how you do it, but just the fundamental framework is a problem of being idealistic without being concerned with how you carry it out. Now, there are, the issue then is, a relevant moral one is, well, when and how do you get pragmatic? And that's been an issue for a while, and it's gotten a little worse lately, and I'll get to where I think it's worse. But I just want to talk about what the general rules are. Well, the problem you have, and I'm talking now as a legislator, as someone who advocated ideas, and there were people who voted for me, who helped me win, who had these views. And the issue is, will they accept the fact that you compromise? Clearly, you might be wrong in your judgment. You may have misread things. But the problem has gotten worse of late because of the division among people who are politically active. The polarization that we face, it has this effect. People who are politically active these days live in parallel universes. They hear and read and know different things. It's MSNBC and the Huffington Post versus Fox and Breitbart. And the problem, and by the way, I'm told, and I read this, increasingly, people even live with people they agree with. That political division is now affecting residential choices and patterns, and there is an increasing geographic polarization. But here's one of the problems with that. People come to think, who feel very strongly, that their views are the majority, because everybody they know thinks that way. Everybody they hear thinks that way. That poses a particular problem when they're asked to accept a compromise, because their view is not that the people who claim to be their advocates correctly assessed the situation and couldn't get more done, so they accepted the most they can. They are increasingly convinced that their advocates sold them out. It's a betrayal. That's why my topic. That is, I'll give you one very recent example, well, not so recent, but for me it was from my career. In 2009 and 10, when we were unable to get even a public option as part of the health care bill, many of us wanted to expand Medicare, some, but we couldn't even get a public option, a state-offered plan. And we couldn't get a public option because we didn't have the votes for it. And I have, at the time and since, had people say, why don't you guys get a public option? You're sold out. You're afraid of the insurance companies. The answer was we didn't have the votes. In fact, health care passed by one vote in both the House and the Senate. Wasn't a lot of margin. But the response I got when I would tell people that we didn't have the votes was, what do you mean you didn't have the votes? Everybody's for it. I mean, I would explain, well, we just don't have a majority in the country for it. And their answer was, oh, yeah, what's the matter with you? Everybody I know is for it. And everybody that person knew was for it. But he didn't know a lot of people who were against it. But that's infecting the politics. So I try to now sort of justify this. And I want to talk about, there are questions about when do you compromise? Over and above that, over and above the argument that we've been betrayed, there has always been a view that you should not compromise. This is among people who are very, very firmly committed to something. Because if you accept less than your full desire, you are going to never be able to get better than that. And in fact, it is better to leave 80% on the table and walk away, because that will make it easier for you to get 100% the next time. So I will quote Alan Greenspan now on procedure, not substance, because I rarely agree with him on substance. He was asked once by here I agree with the substance, well, he was asked in one hearing by a Republican, isn't it true that if you cut taxes, you will wind up with more government revenue because it will produce more economic activity? And Greenspan said, Congressman, that is theoretically possible, but it has never happened in my lifetime. And he was then 86 years old. So it is theoretically possible. And occasionally you might be in a situation where if you don't alleviate a problem, if you make something better, you have lost the chance to make it even better later. I can't think of any. I mean, the notion that worse is better is almost never true. One rare exception. If you have a change, in a lame duck period where you're going to have a change in the officials, yeah, you might wait and not let it done. But in general, the notion that by walking away from 80%, you'll have a better chance of getting 100%, it just factually isn't true in my historically. And there are reasons why it's not true as well. In many cases, the debate about something is not about the ultimate moral goal, sometimes it is, but it's about the method, about whether or not this is an appropriate thing to have government do. Getting part of what you are looking for helps you get the rest, because it helps diffuse the argument that this will be disruptive. And I'll give you one example, another one very controversial. In 2007, Democrats finally took over the House, and we filed a bill to prevent discrimination in employment against gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. We were a couple initials short of where we now are today, but I think the general point was good. At one point, I was in a meeting and someone said, well, somebody talked about GLBTQI. It said, hey, I remember when it was only G. And I said, yes, but I remember when it was only F. That's when I was starting out. There was, the word for us was F. It had none of the other adjectives. But we bring the bill up, and it turns out that we have the votes in the Democratic-controlled House, but it wasn't a huge margin, to pass a bill in the House to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation, but not gender identity. We're a few votes short on gender identity. We only had 7 Republicans ready to vote with us on this, and we lost enough Democrats. We had 90% of the Democrats, but we didn't have enough for the Republicans. So this was a dilemma faced by Nancy Pelosi, Tammy Baldwin, myself. What's better? Is it better to pass the bill that says you're going to not be able to discriminate based on sexual orientation, or should you do nothing because you include people who are transgender? That became very heated. I thought we went ahead and passed the bill. And I'll give you the reasons why we did it. First of all, from the moral standpoint, if you are talking about something that improves the lot of some people, even if you can't improve the lot of everybody, it does seem to me you have a moral obligation to make it better for at least some people. And in saying that, I want to pay my total disrespect to a very well-intentioned sentiment that I think is the essence of woolly-headed inaccuracy and an argument for solidarity. It is the argument that no one is free until everyone is free. If that were in fact the case, no one has ever been free, and no one ever will be free, because everyone is not going to be free. And the notion that you do not make substantial improvement in the lives of a significant number of people because there were some people who aren't included, you can't do. Now, I have been very impressed. One of the intellectual concepts that I have always found very useful is Pareto optimality. named for Vilfredo Pareto, which is a concept that says, as professionals know, particularly economists, if you have a solution or if you have a measure that will make some people better off and nobody worse off, that's Pareto optimality. And you tend to go ahead with it. If you don't have that, now if you don't have Pareto optimality, if you have a situation where you're going to make some people better off and other people worse off, that's a much more morally challenging thing. And by the way, what I've just described is expanded international trade, NAFTA, China and the World Trade Organization. Those are measures, and I think there's now a recognition of that expanded international trade increased the wealth of America as a whole, but in a way that exacerbated inequality. And so that was something I would not do, even though, yes, I conceded the GDP would be better, higher, but it would be done in a very unfair way. But we have Pareto optimality. This is the question. So we went ahead and we passed the bill in the House. The Senate didn't do it. And it was somewhat symbolic because George W. Bush was president. He was never going to sign it. But my view was, in the first place, we're going to make, if we could only do that and never do anything else, and we can make the lives better for hundreds of thousands of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people who didn't live in states where that was already the law, that's a good thing to do. As for the people who are transgender, we haven't made them any worse off. I wish we could have made it better off. We tried. Then the argument is, okay, but by doing that, are you not leaving them behind? Are you not making it less likely that they will catch up? And sometimes that might be the case. Again, I haven't seen it. I mean, theoretically, it could be the case. In practice, it is almost always no. It is almost always the case, first of all, that getting the political votes to do 4 controversial things is harder than getting the votes to do 1 controversial thing. So to the extent that you have done part of the controversial stuff, it's going to be easier to go back and get it. But even more, with regard to anti-discrimination legislation, and it's true in some other areas, what we had were, they were bigots, but it's not fashionable to be a bigot. So we had people who would say, well, I understand, yes, there shouldn't be discrimination, but once you make it a law, it will be very disruptive. It will cause all kinds of problems. You run into that every time you're trying to do an anti-discrimination law. The truth, by the way, is that anti-discrimination laws are very hard to enforce. And once they're passed and the bigots get sophisticated, they can get around them more easily. But what we faced was an argument where people said, oh, if you pass a law protecting people based on this personal characteristic from discrimination, it'll be a problem. Well, what we could have done if we passed the law was to show that it wasn't a problem, because it hasn't been. And you do part of it and you defang the argument. You de-demonize it. And so I believe that, yes, from the standpoint of including people with transgender, going part of the way would be better. By the way, proof of that is that no state law that I am aware of that protects gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people from discrimination had ever been passed in its entirety for all categories. They were almost all laws, because they came before the transgender issue was so on people's minds. They came earlier, and then people who are transgender were added. Now, one of the counterexamples I'm giving is, well, what about African Americans? You talk about compromise and accepting part of it. Rosa Parks never said she wanted to sit in the middle of the bus. Well, to analogize, in fact, not Rosa Parks herself, but the people who are acting on behalf of this, their first argument was just clean up the back of the bus. If I got to sit here, let the seats be comfortable. Because the first lawsuits that were brought by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, known as the Inc. Fund, because at that point, I think it was called the Inc. Fund, it was like the only corporation that was being nice to black people. So it sort of stood out. But the Inc. Fund, the first cases that it brought on race, and this is in favor of pragmatism, and they bought into segregation. They accepted the premise of separate but equal, and they said, but it ain't equal. Now, obviously, their goal was to show that it was impossible to do, but that's not the way they argued before the court. So there are these 2 cases, Sweat versus Painter, McLaurin against the Board of Regents, where they went into court and showed that with regard to law schools in both Texas and Oklahoma, they weren't equal. And so they integrated those 2 law schools, not by saying separate but equal was wrong, but that separate wasn't equal. And rather than try to make it so, they had to give in. So, I mean, this is the civil rights movement. Then you move on from there, having discredited, to say, you know what, maybe it never can be equal. And then you have the legislative activity. And people said, well, you don't take partial. Well, we're now not talking about who gets covered, but what gets covered. The legal rights of people to be protected against mistreatment because of their race came in 3 separate bills. 1964 was employment, public accommodations. They left out voting. Voting came in 65, and then housing didn't come until 68. And I cannot think of any good social advance that wasn't a compromise when it happened. Now, it is legitimate to argue, well, you know, maybe you had a little bit more strength, more or less. But the rejection of compromise in general it just dooms you. You don't get anywhere. By the way, people are now, and I haven't looked at this, some historians are saying now, frankly, Democrats and liberals might have been better off accepting some of what Richard Nixon was proposing in the domestic area. Because Nixon really didn't care that much about the domestic stuff, and he wanted his freedom in foreign policy. And he was proposing some health care that in some ways was as good as we just got, and we could have had it earlier. But we rejected that because we wanted better. Now, the partisan thing can complicate it. But that's the fundamental issue. So if you're not making anybody worse off, yeah, you make people better off. But also, you're not leaving people behind. And even if you are leaving people behind, I had people say to me, well, you're a gay man, so you're pushing for a law that protects gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, but you're not transgender, so you don't care. Well, as a matter of fact, as a member of a legislative body since 1972, every couple of years I was voting for some anti-discrimination law that didn't cover me. I was pushing for anti-discrimination based on race, based on gender for women, based on age. That caught up to me. I'm now a beneficiary, but I wasn't when I started 40 years ago. Disability. In fact, we passed a law that we all hailed, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protected, from the standpoint of LGBT people, gay men who were HIV positive, but not gay men who weren't, because being HIV positive was a disability. So we passed a law that protected, you had 2 guys, one of whom is HIV positive and his partner is not. The HIV positive partner is protected by the law, but the non-positive partner isn't. Should we not have passed that law? I mean, I don't understand it. And the argument that you're going to leave people behind, no, in the first place, I am not aware of a situation where the victims of any particular form of discrimination really didn't care about generalizing the principle. Or in other cases, those of us who were pushing for the president's health care bill as written, not getting a public option didn't mean we weren't going to try hard for it. In fact, it made it easier, it seems to me, to be additive. So that's been the general principle. Now, I understand people have gotten, there's always been this argument that you're selling people out. It's gotten worse. I think it was fairly straightforward to make the argument I've just made. But here's what's gotten worse. It's gotten worse in part because of the division in the media that I talked about, in the way people see it. It is one thing for me to go to people and say, I'm sorry we couldn't do more. We didn't have the votes. They may grumble. Did you try hard enough? One of the things I am able to do in that situation is people say, well, you say you couldn't talk them into it. It's such an easy case. Why didn't you work harder to persuade them? I almost always, in that case, ask my interlocutor, well, have you ever tried to persuade people of this? Do all your relatives agree with this? Oh, no. Well, why don't you go and persuade them? Oh, geez, who wants to get into that? I mean, that's too hard. You know, persuading people to agree is more easily something that you urge others to do. I was at one political fundraiser for a colleague in California, and one linguistic expert was talking about how weak the Democrats were and what a bad job we were doing about framing the arguments. And if we only framed them right, we could win all these issues that we were losing. And finally, my then partner, now husband, who was in the audience, and he came to question, he said, why don't you run for office? I mean, if that's that easy, why don't you just run and do all that? And the answer was no, he'd never tried it. I mean, it's like, you know, when people tell me how easy it is who've never tried it, I do not think in the history of the world anybody has ever lost a shadow boxing match. But now it's gotten worse for this reason. you have this intensity. It's very hard to persuade people that they haven't, that we can't do it. And beyond that, and part of it is, it's what people want from us. And I have just come to understand that. People are angry at me because I couldn't deliver all of what they wanted, or not me now, I'm not in office, but my colleagues. There's an unreasoning anger that they haven't done more. And there's this demand. There's Tom Steyer, to whom I want to pay my disrespects, who is a very wealthy man who's very good on the environment, and has now announced that he will not contribute funds to any Democrat who is not committed to be for impeachment. So you could be a Democrat in a tough district who supports same-sex marriage, tough action against climate change, an increased minimum wage, a whole range of other right of a woman to choose. But if you don't think this is the right time to be for impeachment, he's not going to help you get elected. There is this kind of, and in fact, here's the problem I now face. I've given you my first half of my argument, which is I could explain and justify compromise in terms of results. I'm getting something done and making things better. The problem now is that the people who are making the demands on us don't want real-world results. They want psychic income. I think the Nobel Prize just given for economics to Richard Thaler, in which he shows that it is a mistake to think that people are always totally rational in their economic decisions, that the economic man who is a constant maximizer of his or her welfare is a mistake, and that people make decisions on other grounds. Well, yeah, but you know what? If that's true, if people are not sort of objective, rational welfare maximizers in economics, even less so in politics. And it's exacerbated by the increasing, and this is the single biggest cultural problem we have today, the continuing and increasing distrust of government, this dislike of government. It's awful. And it unfortunately exists both on the left and on the right. And here's the problem. People have lost confidence that the government can do anything. So when I'm in a situation like that and I'm trying to explain to people, I couldn't give them what they wanted. I wasn't, because I'm trying to get more. They don't think I'm getting anything because they don't believe government works. What increasingly it seems to me people want, and this is both on the left and on the right from the politicians, is they want to feel good. They want to feel that you're all for them. This is what Steve Bannon is doing on his side, but it's what we are doing, what I fear is happening on the left. Now, Tom Steyer knows that there is no way that Donald Trump is going to be impeached in the near term, or the Republicans are for him, out of other reasons, but he wants to feel good about people saying he's going to be impeached. And James Carville, 93, 92, people here remember, knew him. How do you run for president if you're Bill Clinton? It's the economy, stupid. You talk about the economy. I think what's happened is the deterioration in the economic position of working people and others has gotten the alienation that's set in, that the notion that government is the answer, it's almost irrelevant. In fact, that's the answer to why does Donald Trump keep the strongest support from people who would be most hurt by what he is advocating? And why does the advocacy by Democrats of things that would be good for them mean nothing? Because they don't believe it's ever going to happen. They think it's all a play. What they want from Donald Trump is they want him to be feel good. You know what Donald Trump does? There are people who made them, if you're the white working class, some of them, you think that the elitists, the liberals, the minority groups, that they use the government to make you worse off, that these were conscious things that were done to make you worse off. And they are very angry, and they have lost confidence that the government can do anything. So they want someone who's going to denounce the people who hurt them. Donald Trump's appeal to them is, I mean, he's not much of a legislator, the foreign policy is a mess, but he is the insulter in chief. He insults the people that his people don't like, and he does it very well. He's a great insulter, and that makes him feel better. But that complicates the problem, because people are angry with the political people because they're not fully identifying with them, because they're suggesting, when I talk about a compromise, that's implicitly the suggestion that, okay, you're not going to be able to get everything. They don't just see that as saying, I don't have the votes. it's a kind of a denial of the purity of their cause. And so they want psychic income, and I'm trying to meet their need for psychic income by real world results. And I can get more of this healthcare. No, but you got to be for single payer. And if you're not a full-throated advocate of single payer, then you're not my friend. Oh, and by the way, that becomes, it's part of the problem with taking a knee. And I hope we don't get to the point where it's going to be a demand that Democratic politicians, if they want to keep the vote, have to go and kneel. I mean, the taking the knee is such an example of symbolism on both sides. I know it's a problem. I was in the elevator at Washington Duke, and a couple of guys were in there, and somebody said, "What'd you see about what the Bears did from their actions in Chicago?" He said, "Nah, I haven't watched football since that asshole knelt." This is the problem, that more and more people now are dealing in sort of, they want the psychic income, and that's really not fungible. It's hard to deal in that situation. And what then happens is things get worse. And I'm afraid we're going to see a series of litmus tests. I mean, Steve Bannon is doing this to the Republicans, and obviously I'm happy with that. I don't know if you noticed, but as a sign of the hold that Donald Trump still has on his base, Senator Jeff Flake announced today that he's not running for re-election because of his challenging of Trump. I don't want to see this grow where people say on the Democratic side, if you don't wholeheartedly do this, we're not going to be for you. That's very destructive. And people here are working and trying to bring people together. But this insistence, your job is to make me feel good. So the deal. And by the way, that's part of my concern with Black Lives Matter. I started fighting to improve police behavior in 1968. I worked for the mayor of Boston, and we got name tags printed up. So the police would wear name tags. So, you know, at least that's the beginning. You can say who did it. And the city council overrode them. And that, the mayor lost a lot of support for that. Although, actually, it's interesting. When I first became the assistant to the mayor of Boston in 1968, I was at a very popular restaurant in Boston. And the owner said to me, "Hey, you know what? I'm glad that guy's in there. You got to straighten out those cops. Those Irish cops are bigots. They don't listen to anybody. They push you around. You got to put an end to these Irish bigoted cops." You know what his name was? It was Joe Tecci. He was Italian, and he owned a great restaurant in the north end of Boston. And as an Italian, he very much resented the bigotry of the Irish cops. So I have long fought for changes there. And I understand the Black Lives Matter issue, but it's become, I think, saying Black Lives Matter has now transcended doing something about it. And in particular, I have this, and I found this with my gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender friends, where they want symbolic demonstrations of the importance of their cause. And I've been saying this to LGBTQ people for a long time, and I'm saying it now to some African Americans and some of the immigrants. The worst example of this, by the way, were the Dreamers, these wonderful young people who were brought here against their will, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer do a great thing and get Donald Trump to agree that he's going to support them, although, you know, the half-life of a Trump promise is instantaneous. But that helped. It becomes harder for them to demonize it. It moves it along. So what do? Because she said, okay, we'll accept the bill which gives the Dreamers their status, but we'll include some tightening of the border. They go and denounce her and attack her in her office because she didn't say, she conceded that in the current reality, to get done what they wanted, she had to give something else. That impugned the purity of their cause. That sullied it. We are right, and we are entitled to have this done as a matter of right. And how dare you trade for it, as if what we wanted somehow had to be compensated for. Well, she didn't agree with that, but that was the reality. And I really want to say to people like that, where you have people, elected officials, who are committed to making your lives better, who are committed to achieving things on your behalf, why do you insist that they put that forward in the way least likely for them to be able to succeed? Why do you have the rule that the way to show that you care about me is to be obnoxious to everybody else, even at the cost of doing what you're doing? And I fear this trend in our politics, and we've always felt this as a metaphor that people who've been around a long time know, and it seemed to me a little bit too tired, but that there was a difference in members of Congress, you've heard it, Joel, between the show horse and the workhorse. That the workhorses were the people who really did everything. The show horses were the one who were on television. In fact, I think that's a false dichotomy. It can do both. But what I'm afraid of now is this. As the strongest advocates on both sides want more and more psychic income, they want more and more advocacy undiluted. They want people to say that they're right and not trade for it. I mean, I have a holy cause. Don't go out and horse trade for my holy cause. That's kind of demeaning. I mean, shades of Martin Luther and the selling of indulgences. That's tawdry. You're abusing something holy. And so what happens is there are people who are perfectly willing to deal in this psychic income. They're usually people from very safe districts. And they get good press when they do that, and they get a lot of love, and they get a lot of contributions. You know, one of the things I would say about whether you're an advocate or an elected official, to the extent that you care about something controversial, the more of your time you spend reinforcing the views of those who agree with you and basking in their admiration, the less likely you ought to be helping your cause. And what you have is this danger. I'm afraid that there is going to be this, the people who want to get something done in real terms are going to be disadvantaged. They're going to be under pressure. They're going to lose out to people who simply want to give them the psychic income. And I believe that is a very real danger, and that's why I want to talk about this. I want to say to people, don't look, these are people trying to help you. Why do you want to make them lose? Well, I mean, I hope it doesn't get to the point. There are some Democratic members of Congress. Democratic members of Congress have behaved wonderfully. I know it's very unfashionable to talk about party as being good. I mean, excessive partisanship is a terrible thing. But there's never been a functioning democracy in the history of the world without political parties if they do well. And the partisanship, by the way, is relatively recent. It's when the Republicans got taken over by the Tea Party in 2009. That wasn't the case before. But I know if you do a word search these days, I'm serious about this, try and find anything written or on the internet where partisan is used in a positive way. And you have to go back to World War II and read about the partisans who were the fighters against the Nazis in Yugoslavia. That's the last time people use the word. And it's a big mistake, I think, but it's jeopardizing our ability to get things done as this gets sharpened. And you are going to have those people who are seriously trying to accomplish things lose out and get great pressure from the people who just want this to be invoked. They want to be made to feel good. And Donald Trump is the example of that. Now, Trump is losing support in a number of other people who are serious about public policy, conservatives, economic conservatives. He's losing them. Interesting. Rupert Murdoch obviously is an ideologue. He's very conservative, but he ain't stupid, and he doesn't lose track of his money. Rupert Murdoch has two major media outlets: the Wall Street Journal, which has an upscale demographic, and Fox News, which has a more working-class, blue-collar demographic. And if you read them both or watch them, what you now see, because I've been reading the Wall Street Journal to catch this, the Wall Street Journal is becoming increasingly anti-Trump. Fox News still loves him because the people who read the Wall Street Journal, not so hotsy-totsy on Trump, the people who read Fox still love him. So Murdoch is not incapable of shading his media influence to make his patrons somewhat happy. But that's the real danger we have today, that there will be this insistence. And again, it's happening on their side. It started to happen before. There were some Democratic senators holding now who got elected only because the Republican went that far to the right. But I think Trump's problematic governance gives us a real chance. I am afraid that this tendency to reject compromise, and again, it was easy to defend compromise when we are all talking about results. I think it is relatively easy to demonstrate to people that the right kind of compromise can give you better results. But it can't compete. Pragmatism can't compete with with the demand for a recognition of the unfettered purity of your cause. And that's what I hope people will start to argue against. So with that, I'm ready now to throw this open.
So we have a little bit of time for questions, and so what we'll do is open the floor for questions, and please do keep them short. There's a floor mic back here, so if you would go to the mic and ask your question so we can all hear. We'll do it this way.
Thank you, Congressman Frank. You clearly articulated the problem and the current situation that we're in, and the tremendous bifurcation of the public. I just wonder if you would think and share with us your ideas. Where do you think this is leading to, and what is the solution?
One of the things I am afraid it leads to is a vicious cycle in which people are angry at government and believe it doesn't work. And the more they believe it doesn't work, the less it will work, because the more people will be elected to office either who don't want government to work, or if they want to, will be pulled away from that by being told they can't compromise. That's an increasing problem, that there are more and more litmus tests. The alternative, I do think there's a lot of resistance to that. And I mentioned my Democratic colleagues. What I'm hoping is this. The Democrats, Donald Trump is right when he complains that his problem is he's not getting any help from the Democrats. He's not, and I'm very proud of that. When I was in Congress under Ronald Reagan, he got a lot of help from Democrats. There were a lot of Southern Democrats, but even some Northern Democrats. They were voting for Reagan. Trump's a much less attractive political figure. And there has been unanimity on the Democratic side. He didn't get a single Democratic vote against the president's health care bill. He didn't get undoing the Iran agreement. Democrats who oppose the Iran agreement now say, wait a minute, it's crazy to kind of undo it, and they're not with them. And what I'm hoping is this. I hope that and I want people to talk about this, and I'm doing this. I would hope that the great solidarity the Democrats have shown in opposing Trump on virtually everything will buy them some credibility. Will get people to say, no, well, you can trust these people. They saved health care. They prevented them from doing anything about financial reform. You can please trust them so that you can accept the fact that they are in fact trying. And I think that's a realistic possibility, that you have to go to people and say, hey, look, they're trying. Longer term, how do you end with the polarization? Let's be very clear. I've been urging some of the students that I've been talking to, go write a paper. People, for many of them, that's all they've known is this Sturm und Drang of the political system. But it only started in 2009. I mean, it was getting worse. But the George W. Bush administration wasn't full of this. They had the bipartisan No Child Left Behind. I voted against it, but Teddy Kennedy was for it. Even the Iraq War, unfortunately, had a lot of Democrats. And then when the financial crisis came, the Democrats were totally cooperative with George W. Bush. If you read the books written by the Bush administration people, Paulson, Bernanke, Sheila Bair, what happened in American politics was this. First of all, the Democrats take over everything. And the Republicans have been moving conservative, and the Republicans are then freed from any responsibility. And Lord Acton got it wrong. It is not the case, at least in our democratic system, that absolute power corrupts. What corrupts in a democracy is impotence. What is corrupt are the people who are in positions in which they have some power, but nobody holds them responsible for it. So the Republicans, beginning in 2009, could be completely irresponsible. They could let things die. They're aided by another factor. And it's, I'm not a big Bible invoker, but there's one biblical story that I think is quite relevant to our current politics, and it's the story of King Solomon. King Solomon, two women come to King Solomon with a baby, and they both claim the baby is theirs, and he says, I'll cut it in half. And when he says he's going to cut it in half, the real mother says, oh, no, all right, let her have it, because she was the real mother. Okay, government is the baby. The voters are King Solomon. The Republicans are the fake mother, and we, the Democrats, are the real mother. And when the threat comes to cut the baby in half, government's our baby. We're the pro-government party. They don't care for government. They just as soon see it cut in half. And so we have had to back down sometimes because they can invoke that threat. Unfortunately, the voters, and they have a right, they're the voters, but King Solomon, they're not. So this is part of the problem. But so I think what they then moved far to the right, and the Tea Party took them over. But Donald Trump is the potential answer as much as he is the problem. I do think Trump's behavior, his incompetence, et cetera, he is undermining. I mean, people hated government. Trump is making government look good by comparison. I mean, look at healthcare. People are persuaded government sucks. But under Trump, some of them saying, you know what, but no government may suck worse than government. And the healthcare bill is now popular. So the optimistic scenario is that Democrats come back in power, in part because of this, and then use their power to show the government can work. And Republicans, the mainstream conservative Republicans, not the liberals, then are finally forced to try to take back their party. But but the other alternative is that they stay in power, people get angrier and angrier, nobody believes in government, and our politics becomes more and more fighting between two clashing sets of symbols. And those people who want to compromise, who want to get something done, are increasingly assailed by the symbolists on both sides.
So I totally agree about bemoaning this situation that we've gotten ourselves into. I want to hear how we got into it. What do you think really is causing people to be unwilling to be pragmatic and to compromise? I mean, some people have said it's gerrymandering and you've got these safe districts and that's what creates the problem, but that can't be right because it's the Senate. That would truly affect the Senate, exactly. Yeah, and so that can't be it. And so what do you think is causing this refusal to compromise?
As far as gerrymandering is concerned, gerrymandering is a problem, but it is quite clearly chronologically much more the effect of the hyperpartisanship than the cause, because the gerrymandering came after the Republican right wing won so well in 2010, and the severely awful. And
I agree. So what is the cause?
First of all, they took over, and secondly, the anger was such. I think the fundamental cause is the economic transformations in the Western world, which put working people who did not have any particular skills or education at a relative disadvantage. White guys in '75 could go to work in the auto plant or the steel plant. White guys, if you're black or a woman, you weren't in such good shape. But white guys, their relative economic position has deteriorated significantly because of trade, because of technology, because our economy has transformed, and the people in charge were the kind of they did not accept Pareto optimality. They looked at technological change and trade and globalization in general, and they said, these are good things because they increase the overall gross domestic product. They did not focus on the extent to which it was unfairly being distributed and made some people worse off. And people were getting angrier and angrier. And then came the financial crisis of 2009, 2008. And both the financial crisis and then the reaction to it is what really ignited it. You had people angry that the banks caused this problem, which they did, and they seemed to have gotten away with it, which they didn't. In fact, yes, money was lent to them. It was all repaid. By the way, of the money paid out in the TARP, it was only 375. They never paid the whole 750. Of that 375, the money that was lent to the banks was repaid. The federal government made a profit. The only money that the federal government did not recover was the money which we paid to the auto industry, which I'm glad we did. We saved General Motors and Chrysler. But people got angry, and you saw that because what you saw in 2009 were the formation of two entities. It only started then. The Tea Party on the right and Occupy on the left. And you had Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, things are tough now. They know people are angry. So he's able to say, hey, Democrat, House, Senate, President, we're not going to help you do anything. we're going to just, so the Republicans were then able to move in a total opposition to everything. And the politics, already you have white guys who are angry. They're now more likely to accept a conspiratorial theory, and you have the two groups. And then exacerbating is this, the two groups, Occupy and the Tea Party, similarly motivated in some ways. So Occupy was upset that too many people were not getting help with their mortgages. The Tea Party was furious that too many people were getting help with their mortgages. And some were and some weren't. I wish there were more that were getting help. But what then happens is, and this is a problem in our politics between the right and the left, people on the right tend to be more believers in the system ultimately. You know, in the Tea Party, they put on their little tricorn hats. They're the American patriots. So their response has been to get more involved in politics. The left is more likely to say, oh, the system is corrupt, it doesn't work, it's a fraud, and move out of politics. And you saw that with the Tea Party and Occupy. What the Tea Party did, and this is where, the Tea Party then went on and took over the Republican Party. And you had a series of primaries in 2010 where mainstream conservative Republicans got beat. Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who's a fairly significant, thoughtful figure, loses the gubernatorial primary to Rick Perry, who's a goofball. There's no way Rick Perry would have beaten Kay Bailey Hutchinson in a normal year, but they called her Kay Bailout Hutchinson, and she lost. So that's what happened. So the Republican Party gets moved to the right. We have Occupy as theoretically not theoretically, but as the alternative, but where the Tea Party took over the Republican Party, they registered to vote, they voted in primaries. Occupy essentially smoked dope and had drum circles. And those don't help much politically. I mean, I wish they were more available to us. I was in a TV show with one representative of Occupy, and I said I was troubled. I see the Occupy sites. I went by a couple. I never saw a voter registration table at an Occupy site. She said, well, that's not what we're into. But I do think the underlying anger was in the economic erosion. And some Democrats were blind to it, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, whom I otherwise liked, pushing the trade bills. And there is now, by the way, The Economist, yes, The Economist magazine now admits that they were wrong about trade. There is now a consensus among economists, overwhelming, that allowing China to join the World Trade Organization in 2000 had a statistically significant effect in hurting unskilled American workers. And the problem with both Clinton and Obama, in my mind, was they understood the negative distributional effects. But what they said, and I mean literally talking to them, you should insist on offsetting this. And both of them said, oh yeah, we're for that. We have a series of bills that we're for that will undo it. The problem was that they did them separately. So they asked for trade bills, and then they asked for social and economic offsets. And the Republicans were happy to join them in passing the trade bills, and then kill the others. They should have been put in one bill. But I think that's what, and then you have, added to it is the internet. The greatest source of misinformation by far in the history of the world. And among other things, it's part of the reason that people don't like government. I'm not a big internet watcher, as you might expect, and I don't understand why I'm supposed to care where anybody had lunch, since I don't own a restaurant, so I don't watch Facebook or read it. But I do know this. No clip of a United States senator praising a cabinet secretary for a job well done has ever gone viral. I mean, I know that. My husband is asked by people sometimes when we've been somewhere socially, they know, gee, you know, you realize what they're getting at. They're sort of trying to be nice. You know, he's nicer than you expect him to be, isn't he? Yeah. He said, well, that's because the only time you ever see him is when they choose to put him on the media, and it's one of those rare moments when people are in an argument, and they're fighting, and they're angry. So the internet exacerbates it. But Trump is the way I hope to break out of it. I have one very specific thing I want us to do, and that's the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis is a problem more among Trump's voters than about anybody else. You know, this is a white crisis, the opioid crisis, not entirely. Crack was more of a black one. And it's also very clear, the only way you're going to diminish this problem is by a great increase in government. I mean, in fact, that was one of the things that helped save the health care bill, because in some cases, people were talking about opioid, and Trump said, I want to help with the opioid crisis. And the answer was, By the way, if you want to make the opioid crisis and its negative implications 100 times, why don't you give it to Medicaid? Medicaid is the treatment network for people with the opioid crisis. So I think we Democrats should come together with a big assault on the opioid crisis and say, by the way, this is government. We want the government to do more of this. We want more money. We want to expand Medicaid. We want to create more facilities. We want to provide more help for people who are to be counselors. So I think we get a chance now to show, yeah, government can do some good things. I mean, it's got to be two-step. If we are able to take power in any branch of government, thanks to Trump, we must immediately come forward with a program that has real benefits for people. And maybe we go from there.
Hello. In the nearly a year, since the election, I've been talking to people kind of trying to spread the same kind of message that you're trying to send, that pragmatism and taking a little bit, taking what you can get, is the right way to go forward. And I'm receiving a lot of responses to the effect that that would be true if we had lost the popular vote, but they're basically saying that because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by the wide margin that she did, that we shouldn't treat this like any sort of situation that we need to compromise in. Well, I agree with your position, but I'm wondering what your response to them would be. I give you two answers. They're right when it comes to the broader ideological question. Yes, it's true. I think the notion that we have to walk away from the advocacy of liberal positions, that's correct. I mean, yes, we've had problems. The Democrats have gotten more votes than the Republicans in every election beginning in 1992 except 2004. But I'm differentiating now. That's different than what you do in terms of getting the government to work. So yes, we should not admit error and flee from liberal positions and give up on immigration. And I should have been more explicit. What I'm talking about, though, is what you do in terms of getting the government to work. Whether, no, Nancy, and maybe there's a confusion, I understand. Nancy Pelosi has in no way retreated from the notion, or Chuck Schumer, that the morally correct thing to do, and a good thing for the country from the economic standpoint, is to let the dreamers stay here and become citizens. But we don't have the votes. So then the question is, given that you believe that, if you can get a deal with Donald Trump so you achieve that for the dreamers, at the cost, not of a wall, but of some more measures that tighten the border, that you may not be for, but that don't do horrible things, you do that. So I would divide the answer. The answer is yes, that you're right about the overall popular vote, and we should not retreat from our advocacy. But when it comes to given for the next 2 years, when the government is as it is, or I'll give you another example of what Senator Patty Murray is doing with Senator Lamar Alexander, trying to work out something that, now, there was an argument, hey, why should we help? Trump's going to get blamed, let it get screwed up. But there are people going to get hurt if we don't do this. So I think, yes, with regard to ideological advocacy, we shouldn't give in. We did get more votes. But with regard to what you can get the government to do, reality is reality. And if we can get some improvement like this, if we have to give them something, we do it.
Questions? One more.
Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed your comments, especially your opening comments about free speech. On college campuses, this is such a big issue for us. As you know, the University of Florida, or the state of Florida, supposed to spend enormous sums, $600,000 last week, to provide security around the presence of a speaker. And what I found particularly powerful about your opening comments, of course, is that you have been in the position of feeling like you were the oppressed or the marginalized in that conversation. And I'm wondering, now that on college campuses, this debate around free speech is so tied up with identities and marginalized identities in particular. And part of the pushback is exactly that they may be feeling like they are being shut up again or being marginalized again. And And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how college campuses should navigate this free speech crisis that we seem to be facing, and the extent to which we have credibility or a problem with credibility in doing that, in being so liberal and one-sided in who we are as a faculty by and large.
The first thing I would say as a practical thing, when people say, well, we're going to be marginalized again, that's why we have to shut these people down. The practical answer is, no, you're marginalizing yourselves more by doing that. That is, if you do get the victory of not having to listen to somebody on your campus, the price you're paying for that is a deterioration in public opinion towards you, because this is more unpopular with people outside, without question. Beyond that, I think, well, I guess we have to, you know, in some ways now this is the reverse. I've always had this problem with the conservatives, where they are against something because they say it's going to have terribly negative consequences, and then it doesn't have negative consequences, but somehow we can't break through to have it. I mean, people were against same-sex marriage because they said it would be destabilizing. We knew that was nonsense. And it wasn't until the Supreme Court of Massachusetts gave us marriage that we can then show that wasn't true. By the way, that model where people are against something because they think it's going to have terrible consequences, and it turns out it doesn't, and then when you get it, it doesn't work, that's the model we're now following with marijuana, where there were all these predictions about how terrible it would be, and we've had legal marijuana in a number of states, and there are no horror stories, because you know if there were, you'd hear about them, if people were you know, really having bad results from this. But I think the way I'm saying that is to students is this: you say you're being marginalized. In the first place, you are greatly magnifying the impact of these people. These are degraded, some of them, I mean, they don't persuade anybody. And what will happen is in some cases they'll be allowed to speak, and I want to go back to them a week later and say, so, that person spoke. Would you explain, how's your life been affected negatively? Now, I think you have to separate out. What they're really saying is it hurts my feelings. I'm being marginalized. If that's what they're saying, we can say, no, you're not. Where has it happened? There's been no retreat on your legal rights. The university is still protecting you. All that's happening is hurting your feelings, and that's the only thing we can try to do. And I think people just have to stand up and say, look, you know, free speech has often been unpopular, but the other thing I would say is to marginalized groups, if in fact this becomes the norm where you're going to have people shut down, the groups without power are going to get shut down more than the groups with it. But the basic point I would make is simply analyze that and say, show me anywhere where the presence of one of these obnoxious, despicable people who made a speech in any way negatively affected your life, other than the fact that it hurt your feelings.
So we are out of time, and in a moment we'll adjourn and go upstairs for reception. But first, join me in thanking Congressman Frank for such a remarkable conversation this evening. Thank you.